The dust stung Abigail Turner's eyes as she clutched her wailing infant daughter against her chest, desperately trying to shield the tiny face from the biting wind that howled across the Arizona territory. Her wagon stood broken and useless behind her, one wheel splintered beyond repair, her husband 3 days dead and buried beneath a crude wooden cross 2 miles back. As the baby's cries grew more frantic, mixing with the mournful sound of the wind sweeping across the empty plain, Abigail felt her own tears threatening to fall. Then she heard hoofbeats approaching through the gathering dusk, and a deep voice called out, "Madam, you all right?" She turned to see a tall figure on horseback, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He took in the broken wagon, her tear-streaked face and the crying baby in her arms. His expression softened as he stepped closer, and in that moment, with surprising gentleness, he said words that would change her life forever. "Your baby's crying in the wind, but I promise you this, you'll never cry alone again." The year was 1885, and Abigail Turner had never felt more alone in her 23 years of life. Just 3 weeks ago, she and her husband Thomas had set out from their failing farm in Missouri, headed for the promise of a new beginning in California. The baby, Sarah, had been born only 2 months before they left. Thomas had been so certain their fortunes would turn around once they reached the West Coast. Now he was gone, taken by a fever that had struck suddenly and burned through him in less than 2 days. "Name's Preston Cole," the cowboy said, removing his hat to reveal sun-weathered skin and kind brown eyes. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Where you headed?" "California," Abigail replied, bouncing Sarah gently, trying to soothe her cries. "Or we were. Now I don't know." Preston nodded, glancing at the broken wagon wheel. "Nearest town is Seligman, about 10 miles west." He looked at the darkening sky. "Won't make it before nightfall, though. You got supplies for the night?" Abigail nodded weakly. "Some, not much." Preston seemed to consider something before speaking again. "I've got a small camp set up about a half-mile from here. Good water source. You're welcome to share it for the night. Tomorrow I can help get you to town." Abigail hesitated, studying the stranger. In the 3 weeks on the trail, she'd learned to be wary, but there was something in Preston Cole's eyes, a steadiness, a kindness that made her want to trust him. "I have a rifle," she said finally. "I know how to use it." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Yes, madam, I don't doubt that. But I promise you won't need it." As Preston gathered what he could from Abigail's wagon, securing it to his horse, she thought about what had brought her to this moment. She and Thomas had married young. She was just 19 when they wed. The son of a farmer, Thomas had inherited land that turned out to be more trouble than worth, the soil depleted after years of poor management. When baby Sarah came along, Thomas became desperate to provide a better life. California seemed the answer to everything. "Ready?" Preston asked, holding the reins of his horse, now laden with her essential belongings. Abigail nodded, adjusting Sarah in her arms. The baby had finally quieted, her tiny fist curled against her mother's collar. "It's not far," Preston assured her, leading the way. As they walked, the landscape bathed in the golden light of sunset, Preston Cole kept a respectful distance but maintained easy conversation. He explained he was a rancher with land outside Seligman, returning from delivering cattle to a buyer in Flagstaff. "Been ranching there 7 years now," he said. "Started with just 10 head of cattle, got about 100 now." "You've done well for yourself," Abigail remarked. "Well enough. Land's good there, better than most places in the territory." He glanced at her. "What was your husband's plan for California?" Abigail swallowed hard at the mention of Thomas. "Farmland. He heard there was fertile soil in the Sacramento Valley, thought we could grow almost anything there. Preston nodded but said nothing, allowing a comfortable silence to fall between them as they continued walking. True to his word, Preston's camp was well situated near a small spring. He quickly built up the fire he'd left banked earlier, then set about making a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. He insisted Abigail rest while he prepared everything. "You've had a harder day than most," he said simply. As they ate, Sarah slept peacefully beside them on a bedroll Preston had laid out. The night air grew cold quickly, but the fire kept them warm. Abigail found herself telling this stranger the whole story her life with Thomas, the failed farm, the journey west, and the terrible days of Thomas's illness and death. "I buried him myself," she said quietly. "Didn't know what else to do, couldn't leave him unburied." "Couldn't stay there with Sarah." Preston nodded, his expression solemn. "You did right by him, that takes courage." "I don't feel courageous," Abigail admitted. "I feel lost." "Most courageous people do," he replied, pouring her another cup of coffee. "Getting to Seligman is a start. There's good people there. They'll help you figure out what comes next. And what if there is no next?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. Preston looked at her steadily across the fire. "There's always a next, Mrs. Turner. Sometimes we just need help finding it." That night, Abigail slept better than she had since Thomas fell ill. Preston kept watch most of the night, adding wood to the fire, ensuring they stayed warm. When Sarah woke crying in the early hours, he brought Abigail a cup of water while she nursed the baby, then discreetly moved away to give them privacy. Morning came crisp and clear. Preston had coffee brewing before Abigail even stirred. As they prepared to leave, he asked permission to fashion a sling for the baby using a spare blanket. "It'll make the walking easier," he explained, demonstrating how to tie it securely. The makeshift sling worked wonderfully, keeping Sarah secure against Abigail's chest while freeing her hands. The walk to Seligman took most of the morning, but Preston kept the pace gentle, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories that made the miles pass more quickly. As they crested a small rise, the town of Seligman came into view, a collection of wooden buildings lining a main street, with scattered houses and corrals spreading outward. It wasn't large, but to Abigail, it looked like salvation. "That's my place," Preston pointed to the northeast, where a modest ranch house sat nestled against rising hills, a barn and corrals visible nearby. "Town's got a decent boarding house. Mrs. Henderson runs it. She's strict but fair." As they entered Seligman, several people called out greetings to Preston, who responded with friendly nods and waves. Abigail felt eyes on her, curious glances from townspeople noting the newcomer. The boarding house was a two-story structure with a wide porch and clean white trim. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, but a kind smile that softened her features. "Preston Cole, who's this you've brought to my doorstep?" she asked, eyes moving from Abigail to the baby and back. "Mrs. Abigail Turner and her daughter Sarah," Preston explained. "They had some trouble on the trail. Wagon broke down about 10 miles east." Mrs. Henderson's expression immediately softened. "You poor dear. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted." Before Abigail could protest, Preston was negotiating payment for a room. 2 weeks to start, he insisted, counting out coins. That should give Mrs. Turner time to get her bearings. "Preston, I can't accept," Abigail began. "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's neighborly. You'd do the same if our positions were reversed." Mrs. Henderson showed them to a small but clean room on the second floor with a view of the main street. There was a narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a rocking chair by the window. Bathrooms at the end of the hall, she explained. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. I keep a pot of coffee on all day in the parlor downstairs. She gave Abigail a sympathetic look. You rest now. Everything else can wait. When Mrs. Henderson left, Abigail turned to Preston, who stood awkwardly by the door. I don't know how to thank you. No need, he said, placing his hat back on his head. I'll see about your wagon tomorrow. Might be salvageable. If not, we'll figure something else out. Mr. Cole, Preston, please. Preston, I can't impose on your kindness any further. You've already done more than enough. He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Mrs. Turner, out here people help each other. That's how we survive. He nodded toward Sarah, now sleeping peacefully in the makeshift sling. Get some rest. I'll check on you tomorrow. After he left, Abigail placed Sarah on the bed and sat in the rocking chair, looking out at the dusty Main Street below. For the first time since burying Thomas, she allowed herself to feel something other than grief and fear. It wasn't exactly hope, not yet, but it was the possibility of hope, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast in the boarding house dining room, Abigail was surprised to see Preston arrive with a wagon and driver. Morning, he greeted her. This is Jim Watson. He's headed out to bring back what we can salvage from your wagon. I thought you were going, Abigail said, confusion evident in her voice. Change of plans. Thought I might show you around town instead if you're agreeable. Jim, a weathered man in his 40s, tipped his hat to Abigail. Don't you worry about your belongings, madam. I'll bring back everything worth saving. After Jim departed, Preston gave Abigail a tour of Seligman. It was larger than it had appeared at first glance. Besides the general store, there was a bank, a small school, a church, 2 saloons, one respectable, one less so, according to Preston, a doctor's office, a blacksmith, and various other businesses catering to the needs of the town and surrounding ranches. Dr. Samuel Green, Preston said as they passed the doctor's office. Good man. You might want to have him check on the little one just to be safe after your journey. Abigail nodded, adjusting Sarah in her arms. The baby was wide awake today, taking in the new surroundings with curious eyes. At the general store, Preston introduced Abigail to the proprietor, a friendly man named Henry Davis who insisted on giving Sarah a tiny wooden rattle. On the house, he said when Abigail tried to decline. We don't get many new babies in Seligman. It's a welcome sight. Throughout the morning, Abigail was struck by how well-respected Preston seemed to be. Everyone they encountered greeted him warmly, and he introduced Abigail with a courtesy that made her feel less like a helpless widow and more like an honored guest. You've made quite a place for yourself here, she remarked as they stepped out of the general store. Preston shrugged modestly. It's a good community. Took time, though. When I first arrived, I was just another drifter with big dreams and empty pockets. What changed? Hard work, luck, and people willing to give me a chance. He looked at her directly. Same as you'll get. By midday, they stopped for lunch at a small cafe run by a Chinese couple. The food was simple but delicious, and Abigail found herself enjoying her first real meal in days. Mr. and Mrs. Chen came here during the railroad construction, Preston explained. When the crews moved on, they stayed and opened this place. Best food in town. As they ate, Preston asked gentle questions about her skills and experiences. When Abigail mentioned she had worked as a schoolteacher before marrying Thomas, his eyes lit up. Our schoolteacher, Miss Whitfield, is leaving at the end of the month, getting married and moving to Prescott. Oh, I couldn't. Why not? You're qualified. The town council's been worried about finding a replacement before the new school term. Abigail looked down at Sarah. I have a baby to care for. Many of the women in town would be happy to help with that. Mrs. Henderson, for one. He leaned forward, Just something to consider, no pressure. After lunch, they visited the church, where Preston introduced her to Reverend Miller and his wife, who immediately cooed over Sarah and insisted Abigail join them for Sunday services. "The church is the heart of our community," Reverend Miller said warmly. "Everyone is welcome here." By late afternoon, Jim returned with a wagon loaded with Abigail's belongings. The wagon wheel had indeed been beyond repair, but everything else, her trunk of clothes, Thomas's tools, their cooking equipment, and the few family mementos she'd brought from Missouri, had been recovered. "I'll have these brought to the boarding house," Preston assured her. As the sun began to set, they stood on the main street, the day's tour complete. "Thank you," Abigail said sincerely, "for everything." Preston smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's been my pleasure, Mrs. Turner." "Abigail, please. After everything you've done, I think we're past formalities." "Abigail," he repeated, as if testing how it felt to say her name. "I meant what I said yesterday. You're not alone here." As he tipped his hat and turned to leave, Abigail felt a strange flutter in her chest, a feeling so unexpected it nearly took her breath away. It had been only days since she'd buried Thomas, and guilt immediately followed the sensation. She pushed both feelings aside, attributing them to gratitude and the emotional turmoil of recent events. That night, as she rocked Sarah to sleep in the small boarding house room, Abigail found herself thinking not of the past she'd lost, but of the possibility of a future in this dusty Arizona town. The following days fell into a pattern. Preston would arrive each morning, usually with news or introductions to make. He arranged for Abigail to meet with the town council about the teaching position, which they practically offered on the spot once they learned of her qualifications. "The school term starts in 3 weeks," Mayor Anderson told her. "The position includes room and board in the small house behind the schoolhouse, plus a modest salary." The opportunity was better than Abigail could have hoped for. The teacher's house, though small, would give her independence and a fresh start. When she accepted the position, the relief on the council members' faces was evident. "You've saved us a great deal of worry," the mayor said, pumping her hand enthusiastically. Preston, who had accompanied her to the meeting, looked pleased but not surprised. "I told you they'd be eager to have you." In the days that followed, Preston showed Abigail the schoolhouse and the adjacent teacher's residence, a simple 2-room structure with a small garden plot behind it. The inside needed cleaning and fresh paint, but Preston immediately volunteered to help with the repairs. "I'm handy with a paintbrush," he said, "and I know others who'll pitch in too." True to his word, that weekend saw a small army of volunteers arrive to help prepare the house. Women from the church brought curtains and linens. Men repaired loose floorboards and a leaky roof, and even the children helped by weeding the neglected garden. Abigail was overwhelmed by the generosity. "I don't know what to say," she told Preston as they painted the main room together. "Say you'll stay," he replied simply. "The town needs a good teacher, and I think maybe you need Seligman too." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Abigail looked away first, busying herself with the paint can. As the days turned into weeks, Abigail found herself settling into Seligman. The teacher's house became a home, the townspeople became friends, and the grief that had threatened to consume her began to ease, making space for new experiences and emotions. Preston remained a constant presence, though he was careful to maintain a respectful distance. He never presumed, never pushed, but he was always there when needed. He built a cradle for Sarah from pine boards, carved with delicate wildflowers along the sides. He brought books for the school and fresh vegetables from his ranch. And when Abigail's first day of teaching arrived, He was waiting outside the schoolhouse with a bouquet of wildflowers and a reassuring smile. "You'll do wonderfully," he said, handing her the flowers. "Those children are lucky to have you." That first day was indeed challenging, with 20 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old, each at different levels of education. But by the end of the week, Abigail had established a routine and begun to connect with her pupils. Teaching, she discovered, was like riding a bicycle. The skills returned quickly once she began. Sarah, now almost 4 months old, thrived in their new environment. Mrs. Henderson, who had taken a particular shine to the baby, often cared for her during school hours. Other women in town also volunteered, creating an informal rotation that ensured Sarah was well loved and cared for while Abigail taught. On Sundays, Abigail attended church services, where she was welcomed warmly into the congregation. Afterward, there were usually community meals or gatherings, and she found herself included naturally in the social fabric of Seligman. It was at one such gathering, nearly 2 months after her arrival in town, that Abigail realized her feelings for Preston had deepened beyond gratitude. They were sitting together on a blanket during a community picnic, watching as Sarah, propped up on a pillow, cooed and gurgled at the attention she received from passing townspeople. "She's growing so fast," Preston remarked, gently tickling Sarah's foot and earning a delighted squeal. "Too fast," Abigail agreed. "I can hardly believe she's the same baby I was carrying across the desert just months ago." Preston's expression grew serious. "You've come a long way since then, in more ways than one." "Thanks to you," he shook his head. "No, Abigail. I just helped a little at the start. Everything since then, the teaching position, making this place your home, that's all been you." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Still, I don't know where Sarah and I would be if you hadn't found us that day." "I'm glad I did," he said simply, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. That night, after putting Sarah to bed, Abigail sat on the small porch of her house, looking up at the stars and thinking about Thomas. The sharp pain of loss had gradually transformed into a gentle ache of remembrance. She would always love him, always honor his memory, but she was beginning to understand that moving forward didn't mean betraying what they had shared. The following Saturday, Preston invited Abigail to visit his ranch. "I'd like to show you where I live," he said, "if you'd like to see it." The ranch was exactly as Abigail had imagined from Preston's descriptions, modest but well-maintained, with evidence of hard work and care everywhere she looked. The main house was larger than she expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. "I built most of it myself," Preston explained as he showed her around. "Started with just 2 rooms, added on as I could afford to. Inside was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture and practical touches. There were a few personal items, books, a fiddle hanging on one wall, a patchwork quilt that Preston explained was made by his mother back in Missouri." "You're from Missouri too?" Abigail asked, surprised. Preston nodded. "Jefferson City, left when I was 20. My folks had a small farm there." "Thomas and I were from near Springfield," Abigail said. "Funny we had to come all the way to Arizona Territory to discover we practically grew up neighbors." After the house tour, Preston showed her the barn, the corrals, and introduced her to his ranch hands, 2 Mexican brothers named Miguel and Javier, and a young man named Daniel who couldn't have been more than 18. "Daniel's parents died last year," Preston explained quietly as the young man showed Sarah the chickens. "He's a hard worker, stays in the bunkhouse with Miguel and Javier." They had lunch on the porch, a simple meal of cold chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie that Preston somewhat sheepishly admitted he'd purchased from Mrs. Chen at the cafe. "I can cook," he said, "but nothing you'd want to suffer through on a beautiful day like this." As they ate, Preston spoke of his plans for the ranch, expanding his herd, breeding horses, perhaps planting an orchard on the south slope where the soil was richest. "I always wanted a place of my own," he said. "Somewhere with room to grow, room for a family someday." There was a question in his words, unspoken but clear. Abigail felt her cheeks warm slightly under his gaze. "It's a beautiful place," she said softly. "Anyone would be lucky to call it home." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, but neither pushed further. Instead, they spent the afternoon walking the property, with Preston pointing out his favorite spots: a small pond where deer came to drink at dusk, a stand of cottonwood trees that provided shade in the summer heat, the view from the highest point of his land where you could see for miles in every direction. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Preston drove Abigail and Sarah back to town in his wagon. They were mostly quiet during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached her small house, Preston helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "Thank you for coming today," he said. "It meant a lot to show you my home." "Thank you for inviting us," Abigail replied, suddenly shy. Preston cleared his throat. "There's a harvest dance next Saturday at the town hall. Would you, that is, might you consider attending with me?" Abigail felt her heart quicken. This was more than a neighborly invitation. This was Preston officially courting her. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. "I'd like that," she found herself saying. "Very much." His smile was like sunrise. "I'll come for you at 7 then." After he left, Abigail stood on her porch for a long time, Sarah sleeping against her shoulder, wondering at the turn her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a farmer's wife in Missouri. 3 months ago, she had been a widow with an infant, stranded in the desert. And now she was a school teacher with a home, friends, and a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was making. The week leading up to the dance passed in a blur of school lessons and preparations. The women of the town, upon learning Abigail would be attending with Preston, descended upon her house with offers of dresses, hair ribbons, and advice. "Preston Cole is the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties," Mrs. Henderson declared as she helped Abigail try on a blue dress that had belonged to her daughter. "Half the single women between here and Flagstaff have set their caps for him, but he's never shown particular interest in any of them. Until you." The dress fit perfectly, needing only minor alterations at the hem. Mrs. Chen contributed a silk shawl of deep blue that complemented the dress beautifully. Even Reverend Miller's wife stopped by with a pair of pearl earrings, just to borrow for the evening. The night of the dance arrived clear and cool, with a full moon rising over the eastern hills. Preston appeared at her door precisely at 7, dressed in a clean black suit with a white shirt and string tie. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and for a moment, Abigail hardly recognized the polished gentleman standing before her. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with undisguised appreciation. "As do you," she replied, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "Handsome, I mean." Mrs. Henderson had volunteered to watch Sarah for the evening, so after checking on the sleeping baby one last time, Abigail took Preston's offered arm and they walked together to the town hall. The building had been transformed for the occasion. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor cleared for dancing. A small band played lively tunes in one corner, and tables laden with food and drink lined the walls. When they entered, there was a brief lull in conversation as people turned to look. Abigail felt self-conscious under the scrutiny, but Preston's steady presence beside her gave her confidence. "Don't mind them," he murmured close to her ear. "They're just pleased to see us together." The evening unfolded like a dream. They danced Preston, proving surprisingly light on his feet for a rancher. They laughed. They shared plates of Mrs. Chen's famous apple pie and cups of punch that Mayor Anderson had enhanced with a splash of whiskey. During a break in the dancing, they stepped outside for air. The night was crisp, stars brilliant overhead. They walked a little way from the hall, the music fading into the background. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Preston asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "More than I can say," Abigail replied honestly. "I haven't danced since—" "Well, since before Sarah was born." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Abigail, there's something I need to say." Her heart skipped. "Yes. I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband. I know you're still grieving, and I respect that completely." He took a deep breath. "But I want you to know that I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible in such a short time." Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes. "Preston, please let me finish." He took her hands in his. "I'm not asking for anything right now. I just want you to know how I feel, and to tell you that whenever, if ever you're ready, I'll be here. There's no rush, no pressure." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you for understanding," she whispered. "I do care for you too, very much. It's just complicated," he finished for her. "I understand complicated, Abigail. Life rarely gives us easy paths." Standing there in the moonlight, her hands in his, Abigail felt a surge of gratitude for this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. Without thinking, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she said simply. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a rider coming fast down the main street. They turned to see a man on horseback pull up sharply in front of the town hall, dismount, and rush inside. Moments later, shouts could be heard and people began pouring out of the building. Preston frowned. "Something's wrong." They hurried back to find the town in sudden commotion. The rider, a ranch hand from one of the outlying properties, had brought news that a band of cattle rustlers had been spotted in the area. "They hit the Crawfords' place last night," the man was saying to the crowd that had gathered. "Took 20 head and burned their barn when Mr. Crawford tried to stop them." Mayor Anderson was already organizing the men. "We'll form a posse, ride out at first light." Preston immediately stepped forward. "I'll join you." Abigail felt a cold fear grip her heart. Cattle rustlers were notoriously dangerous, often desperate men with nothing to lose. The dance broke up quickly after that, with men hurrying home to prepare and women gathering to organize supplies for the posse. Preston walked Abigail back to her house in tense silence. "You don't have to go," she said finally as they reached her door. "Yes, I do," he replied gently. "The Crawfords are good people, and if those rustlers aren't stopped, other ranches will be hit too, including mine eventually." Abigail knew he was right, but fear still clutched at her. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise." He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "This isn't my first posse. We'll be back before you know it." The posse rode out at dawn the next morning, a grim-faced group of 20 men led by Sheriff Davis. Abigail watched from her porch, Sarah in her arms as they passed by. Preston tipped his hat to her, his face set in determined lines. The next 3 days were the longest of Abigail's life. She taught her classes, cared for Sarah, and went about her normal routines, but her mind was constantly with Preston and the other men. Reports trickled back the posse had picked up the rustlers' trail. They were heading north toward the mountains. They had split into smaller groups to cover more ground. On the evening of the 3rd day, Abigail was grading papers at her kitchen table when she heard horses approaching. She rushed to the window to see several riders coming down the street, moving slowly. Some men slumped in their saddles. Heart in her throat, she ran outside. The returning posse was indeed a sorry sight, men dirty and exhausted, several sporting bandages, their horses nearly spent from hard riding. She scanned the group frantically, looking for Preston. When she didn't see him, the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Then Sheriff Davis noticed her standing there and approached, his face grim. "Mrs. Turner," he began. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper. "Preston took a bullet," the sheriff said bluntly. "He's alive, but he couldn't ride. Doc Green stayed with him at the Crawford place. They're bringing him in by wagon. Should be here by tomorrow, alive." The word echoed in Abigail's mind, drowning out everything else the sheriff said about the confrontation with the rustlers, how they'd recovered most of the stolen cattle, how 3 of the outlaws were dead and 2 captured. The next morning, Abigail asked Mrs. Henderson to watch Sarah and cover her classes, then borrowed a horse from the livery stable and rode out to meet the wagon bringing Preston back to town. She found them about 5 miles outside Seligman, a slow-moving wagon driven by a ranch hand she recognized as one of the Crawford sons, with Dr. Green and Preston in the back. Preston was pale, his normally tanned face ashen against the blankets he was wrapped in. A bandage circled his left shoulder, spots of blood visible through the cloth. But his eyes were open, and when he saw Abigail riding toward them, a weak smile crossed his face. "You shouldn't be out here," were his first words to her as she dismounted and climbed into the wagon. "Neither should you," she replied, taking his right hand in hers. "But here we are." Dr. Green gave her a brief account of Preston's injury, a bullet through the shoulder, missing any vital areas but causing significant blood loss and the risk of infection. "He needs rest and care," the doctor concluded, "but he's strong. He'll recover fully in time." Preston insisted on being taken to his own ranch rather than staying in town. "I'll heal better at home," he said firmly when the doctor tried to argue. Abigail rode alongside the wagon all the way to Preston's ranch, where Miguel, Javier, and Daniel were waiting anxiously. They helped carry Preston inside and settle him in his bedroom, following the doctor's instructions carefully. After giving detailed care instructions and leaving medicines, Dr. Green prepared to return to town. "Someone should stay with him," he told Abigail, "at least for the first few days." "I'll stay," she said immediately, then hesitated. "But Sarah, I'll send word to Mrs. Henderson," the doctor assured her. "She'll understand, and I'll check back tomorrow." After the doctor left, Abigail found herself alone with Preston, who was drifting in and out of sleep, his forehead hot with fever. She placed cool compresses on his brow, changed his bandages as instructed, and coaxed him to drink the medicine and broth. The ranch hands looked in periodically, offering help and bringing food, but mostly it was just Abigail sitting by Preston's bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest, praying the fever would break. On the second night, when his fever was at its worst, Preston became delirious, muttering and thrashing in the bed. Abigail held his hand and spoke soothingly, trying to calm him. "Don't leave," he said suddenly, his eyes opening but unfocused. "Please don't leave." "I'm right here," she assured him. "I'm not going anywhere." "Everyone leaves," he mumbled. "Mother, father, Elizabeth." "Elizabeth?" Abigail asked gently, wondering if this was a sister she hadn't heard about. "My wife," Preston whispered. "Died in childbed, baby too." Abigail felt a shock go through her. Preston had been married before. He'd lost a wife and child. He'd never mentioned it, but then she realized she'd never asked about his past beyond his origins in Missouri. "I'm sorry," she said, squeezing his hand. "I didn't know." 7 years ago," he continued, his voice fading. "Came west to forget. Never could." His words trailed off as he slipped back into restless sleep, leaving Abigail to process this new information. Suddenly, so much about Preston made sense: his immediate understanding of her grief, his patience, his kindness toward Sarah. He knew the pain of loss intimately. The fever broke the next morning. Preston woke clear-eyed but weak and seemed embarrassed to find Abigail still at his bedside. "You didn't have to stay," he said hoarsely. "Yes, I did," she replied simply. They didn't speak of what he'd revealed during his fever, and Abigail didn't press. If and when he wanted to tell her about Elizabeth, he would. Over the next week, Preston steadily improved. Abigail returned to town during the days to teach and care for Sarah, then rode back to the ranch each evening to check on him. Mrs. Henderson, understanding the situation perfectly, insisted on keeping Sarah overnight so Abigail wouldn't have to transport the baby back and forth. "That man saved you and your child," Mrs. Henderson said matter-of-factly. "The least we can do is help you return the favor." By the end of the second week, Preston was up and moving around the house, his arm in a sling but his color restored and his strength returning. Abigail knew it was time to resume her normal routine, but the thought of not seeing him every day left an emptiness in her chest. On her last evening at the ranch, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Thank you," Preston said quietly, "for everything." "I was returning a favor," Abigail replied with a small smile. "You saved me and Sarah, I saved you, we're even now." Preston turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Is that what we are, even?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Abigail took a deep breath. "During your fever you spoke about your wife, Elizabeth." Preston's face registered surprise, then understanding. "Ah, I wondered if I'd said something. I'm sorry I never told you." "You don't owe me your past, Preston." "No, but I want to share it with you." He sighed deeply. "Elizabeth and I married young. I was 21, she was 19. We came west together, full of dreams. She got pregnant after our first year here. We were so happy." His voice caught. "There were complications. The baby came too early. There was no doctor nearby. I couldn't save either of them." Abigail reached for his hand, her heart aching for him. "I'm so sorry. After I buried them, I threw myself into building this ranch. It was the only way I could keep going." He looked out at the land spread before them. "For years it was just work, sunrise to sunset, existing, not living." His eyes returned to her face. "Until the day I found you and Sarah on that trail." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. "Preston, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know it's still soon for you. I know Thomas's memory is still fresh. I just wanted you to know why I understand what you're going through, and why I meant what I said at the dance. There's no rush, no pressure." Abigail looked at this man beside her, this good, kind man who had suffered his own devastating loss, and yet remained capable of such compassion and patience. In that moment, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "I love Thomas," she said softly. "I always will. He gave me Sarah, and for that alone I'll honor his memory forever." She turned to fully face Preston. "But I believe there's room in a heart for more than one love, different but no less real." Hope dawned in Preston's eyes. "Abigail, I'm not saying I'm ready for promises or commitments," she continued, "but I am saying I'd like to see where this path leads us, if you're willing." His answer was to gently pull her closer, his good arm around her shoulders, and press a tender kiss to her forehead. "I'm more than willing," he murmured against her skin. "I'm grateful." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, not speaking, simply existing in a moment of perfect understanding. The following month saw a gradual deepening of their relationship. Preston was a regular visitor at Abigail's small house behind the schoolhouse. He often brought Sarah little gifts, a carved wooden horse, wildflowers, once even a tiny kitten found in his barn that Sarah immediately adored. As spring turned to summer, they settled into a comfortable routine. Sundays were spent together, often at Preston's ranch, where Sarah delighted in the animals and open spaces. He taught Abigail to ride, gently teasing her city-bred caution, and she in turn introduced him to the poetry and literature she loved, reading aloud on lazy summer evenings while Sarah played nearby. The townsfolk watched their courtship with approving eyes. It was generally agreed that Preston Cole and the widow Turner made a fine match. Even Mrs. Henderson, initially concerned that Abigail was moving too quickly after her loss, eventually conceded that some happiness deserved to be seized when offered. "Life's too short and too hard out here to turn away from joy when it comes knocking," she declared to anyone who would listen. By early autumn, Preston began making improvements to his ranch house, adding a larger kitchen, a second bedroom, expanding the porch. When Abigail commented on the changes, he simply said he'd been meaning to do them for years. But they both knew the truth. He was preparing a home for a family for her and Sarah. The question came on a crisp October evening. Preston had invited Abigail and Sarah for dinner at the ranch, and afterward they sat by the fireplace while Sarah played with her kitten, now grown into a sleek, friendly cat. "I've been thinking," Preston began, uncharacteristically nervous. "A dangerous pastime," Abigail teased gently. He smiled but continued seriously. "The school term ends in December. Your contract with the town will be up for renewal." "Yes," she nodded, wondering where this was leading. "They've already asked if I'll stay on for another year." "And will you?" Abigail studied his face. "That depends." "On what?" "On what you're about to say next." Preston took a deep breath. "I love you, Abigail. I love Sarah as if she were my own. These past months have been the happiest of my life." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I'm asking if you'll marry me. If you'll make this ranch your home, if you'll let me be a father to Sarah, if you'll build a life with me." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfect diamond. "Preston, if it's too soon, I understand. We can wait. But I wanted you to know where I stand, what I hope for." Abigail looked at the man before her, the man who had found her when she was at her lowest, who had helped her rebuild her life, who had shown her that love could come again, different but no less profound. Then she looked at Sarah, happily playing by the fire, secure and loved. The baby who had cried in the desert wind was now a thriving child, surrounded by care and affection. "It's not too soon," she said finally, her voice steady despite her tears. "Not when it's right." Preston's face lit with joy. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Abigail said, laughing through her tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed on Christmas Eve in the Seligman Church, with Reverend Miller officiating and what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Sarah, now a year old and taking her first wobbly steps, was carried down the aisle by Mrs. Henderson, who wept openly throughout the ceremony. Abigail wore a new dress of deep blue velvet, with Mrs. Chen's silk shawl around her shoulders and Reverend Miller's wife's pearl earrings adorning her ears. Preston, handsome in a new black suit, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such love and wonder that Abigail felt her heart might burst with happiness. The vows were simple and sincere, promises to love, honor, and cherish. When Preston spoke the words, "Until death do us part," his voice caught slightly, and Abigail knew he was thinking of Elizabeth, just as she thought briefly of Thomas. But the ghosts of their past seemed to give their blessing to this new beginning, these fresh vows spoken with full knowledge of life's fragility and preciousness. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the town hall, transformed once again with lanterns and greenery for the occasion. There was music and dancing, food and drink, toasts and laughter long into the night. Sarah was passed from arm to arm, spoiled with attention and sweets until she finally fell asleep on Preston's shoulder, one tiny hand curled trustingly against his neck. Late that night, when they finally arrived at the ranch, their home now, Preston carried the sleeping Sarah inside and gently laid her in the new bed he had built for her in what was now her room. Then he returned to Abigail, who stood in the main room looking around at what was now her home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cole," he said softly, taking her hands in his. "It feels right," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Being here with you, with Sarah, it feels like where we're supposed to be." "It is," he assured her. "From the moment I found you on that trail, something told me our paths were meant to cross. My baby was crying in the wind," Abigail remembered, "and you promised we'd never cry alone again." Preston smiled, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. "A promise I intend to keep for the rest of our lives." The years that followed were not without challenges. Life in the Arizona Territory remained harsh at times, with droughts, harsh winters, economic uncertainties, and occasional troubles with outlaws or hostile native tribes. But through it all, Preston and Abigail faced each challenge together, their bond growing stronger with each passing season. Sarah grew into a bright, spirited child who loved the ranch and adored her papa, as she called Preston from the moment she could speak. When she was 3, she gained a brother, Thomas Preston Cole, named for both the fathers who had shaped his sister's life. 2 years later, a sister joined the family, Elizabeth Grace, a nod to the wife Preston had lost and the grace that had brought them all together. The Cole Ranch prospered under their care, expanding to become one of the most successful in the region. Abigail continued to teach, but at home rather than in town, creating a small schoolhouse on their property where their children and those of neighboring ranches received their education. On summer evenings, they would often sit together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard, the setting sun casting long shadows across the land that had become so much more than property to them. It was the foundation of their life together, the soil in which their happiness had taken root and flourished. And sometimes, when a particularly strong wind blew across the ranch, ruffling the leaves of the cottonwoods and carrying the scent of sage and dust, Abigail would remember that desperate day on the trail when all hope seemed lost. She would look at her family, at Preston teaching young Thomas to ride, at Sarah helping Elizabeth pick wildflowers, at the home they had built together, and silently give thanks for the man who had kept his promise that a crying baby and her mother would never be alone again. For in that promise, spoken by a stranger on a desert trail, Abigail had found not just safety or security, but a love that had healed old wounds, created new joys, and proven that even in the harshest landscapes, with courage and an open heart, life could bloom again in unexpected and beautiful ways.